Hi everybody, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today it's my distinct pleasure to once again be joined by Harold Holzer, who wears many hats. For some of you who live in the New York City area, you may have seen Harold at the Met. He's a senior VP for Public Affairs there. He's also been the Roger Hertog Fellow, New York Historical Society, but he's perhaps most famously known for all his prolific volumes on Abraham Lincoln. And today we're going to talk about his latest work, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, The War for Public Opinion, now out with Simon & Schuster. So Harold, thank you so much for taking some time to join us and talk today.
It's always a pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.
Now, there's no shortage of Lincoln books. I think that's perhaps an understatement. But you come at this from a slightly different angle and talk about Lincoln's relationship with the press and really how this transcends even his antebellum life, and that this is not something that he kind of adapts and learns as president, but something he was well aware of even before that. So with that said, why don't you offer us perhaps just a brief overview of really what this book is trying to get at?
Sure. And I realize when I've been asked in recent days on my book tour, book event things, that it's probably the fact that it's so hard to give an overview means I might have simplified the book a little bit. A little late for that. Well, it's several things. It's a retelling of Lincoln's political ascent and presidency through the lens of the editors who covered him, praised him, and attacked him in an era of very partisan, strictly partisan journalism. It's also a joint biography of the Democratic and Republican, or Democratic and Whig earlier, editors. There are always two in every town. And it's a joint biography of the rival editors in Springfield, Illinois, in Chicago, Illinois, in Washington, D.C., when Lincoln was a congressman and later as president. And most of all, a joint biography of the political and journalistic lives of the big three, as I call them. And those were New York's hugely successful editors, James Gordon Bennett of the New York Sun, Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, and Henry Raymond of the New York Times, each of them founding editors of their respective enterprises, each the founders of national editions that spread their fame and their influence west, and each enormously successful, enormously influential, and real pains in the neck to Lincoln. So it's a big story. It's a complicated story, I'll admit, but it runs chronologically. It talks about Lincoln and the press and Lincoln and the press, and ultimately it goes almost from cradle to grave as far as Lincoln's life is concerned.
Now, what drew you to this topic?
I've always wanted to do something on this subject. I mean, I know the book Lincoln and the Press, written 2 years after I was born, and I was born a long time ago, the 1951 book by Robert Harper, which is okay. It's like it keeps talking about coverage. You know, this happened and there was coverage. This happened and there was coverage. And it's a good book. What I wanted to do is bring my various experiences to bear on a subject that is dear to me, because obviously all Lincoln subjects are dear to me. But I was, at the very beginning of my career in 1969, I was lucky enough to get a job on a weekly newspaper in New York right out of college. So, I didn't work at the Washington Post or the New York Times, but I worked at the Manhattan Tribune, named, probably stolen from Horace Greeley. There was no more New York Tribune. And actually some of the editors were old New York Herald Tribune veterans, hence the name. Told great stories about the glory days of journalism. So I did that for 3 years, and then I became a political press secretary. So I was playing the role that John Hay and John Nicolay played in the Lincoln administration, and Lincoln himself played in the Lincoln administration, which is to manipulate news and be a spokesman and juggle relationships with the press. So my three lives. I have a few others. Oh, and then I'm, a PR man basically for the last 40 years in various institutions in government and politics. So I bring to bear the PR experience, the brief but exciting, first job newspaper experience, and the historian's perspective. So this is my dream book, and it was a long dream in the making. It took me really 6 years to do it, to research it and write it.
Now, I wondered, you've already alluded to this, but I think it's worth circling back to just briefly. Part partisan press in the 19th century,
Right.
and obviously newspapers is going to be the primary medium here. I think, today everybody, depending on your political persuasion, be it MSNBC, Fox News, thinks we live in a very partisan press world, and that it reflects kind of some of the gridlock of Washington, and everybody's got their network that they can go to depending on their party. But I think you probably rightly point out that it's got nothing on the 19th century. So I wondered if you could speak to that just a little bit.
Well, I agree, and I've been having fun. I haven't gone on Fox, but I've gone on MSNBC to make this point. As in as well as you can in 3 minutes between reports on the Ebola scare or not scare. So, yeah, more partisan than MSNBC or Fox, and openly and proudly declaring political affiliation. Newspapers were part and parcel of political organizations. They were the head, the politics were the body, the papers were the brains of political organizations. And they glommed onto political guys on the rise and guided their careers and attached themselves, not only because they agreed with them philosophically, but because they lived in the hope of reward. And reward came when you're the political party that you favored. And I mean favored not just in editorials, but in slanted news coverage, openly slanted news coverage, got to power, in which case you got printing contracts, you got your newspaper bought by the legislature, you got advertising by the government, and if you really lucked out, you got political patronage. Lincoln rewarded one of the editors of the Chicago Tribune who'd written a campaign biography, made him postmaster of Chicago, one of the biggest patronage plums in the country. Washington editor, who a former Democrat, was lured to Lincoln's side when Lincoln supported him for the big patronage job of Secretary to the U.S. Senate. His name was John Wayne Forney. After that, he was a Lincoln man all the way. The other big difference is that not only were these newspaper men openly partisan, but very often they were politicians at the same time that they were editors. That's, we have Mike Huckabee doing a show now, but he couldn't keep his show and run for office. Even legally, he's barred from doing it. And others who have shows. Newt Gingrich, my friend, who was nice enough to tweet about my book today, to my shock, to his 1.3 million Twitter followers. I've never been so flattered in my life because we agree on almost nothing except we both like my book, I guess. These folks could not run for office. Speaker Gingrich could not serve as speaker and be a newspaper editor or own a network. So going back to the 19th century, Bennett, Greeley, and Raymond, let's just take those three. Bennett wanted the Jackson Van Buren administration to buy him a newspaper so he could set up as a Democratic paper. They said no. He wanted a job. They said no, because he was vaguely foreign, disagreeable, and not fit for polite company. So he didn't get anything, and he made them pay. He remained a conservative Democratic voice, but very untamable, unusual. Horace Greeley always yearned for political office. He ran for lieutenant governor of New York. He ran for president of the United States in 1872 while he still owned the New York Tribune. He served in Congress as a temporary appointee in the 1840s and served alongside Abraham Lincoln, where they should have forged one of the great historic partnerships between politics and journalism, and they just didn't click. Real tragedy for Greeley, as it turned out, and a thorn in Lincoln's side. And my favorite, because he was such a party man, was Henry Raymond of the New York Times. Speaker of the New York State Assembly, member of the Assembly, lieutenant governor of New York. And he had the trifecta in 1864. In addition to being editor of the New York Times, which he never gave up, he was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, a candidate for Congress from New York City, and the author of a Lincoln campaign biography, which is the equivalent of doing the television commercials for a candidate, all while managing the Times. It's inconceivable today. So if you think that Fox and MSNBC are too partisan, you should have lived through the 19th century.
Now, bringing us back here to Lincoln, and even before he becomes president, he starts to learn the game. He starts to learn how he needs to, I believe, as you said, be a manipulator in chief. Ultimately, by the time he's president, but
long before.
What's his antebellum experience like with the press?
Well, it starts when he's a postmaster, a pro-Whig postmaster in New Salem, getting to read all the newspaper subscriptions that come in before the subscribers get them, and he becomes the local agent for this Whig paper called the Sangamo Journal, which becomes his organ, as they called it in those days. So he's very close to the Journal. They typeset all his speeches. They participate in strategy. And then he's smart enough, wherever he practices law in Illinois, he stops by the local newspaper, meets an editor, ingratiates himself. I mean, typical stories. William Stoddard is the editor of a Whig newspaper in central Illinois. Can't remember the town. He's upstairs setting type. He gets the word, Abraham Lincoln wants to meet you. And he says, well, I'm so busy, it's so annoying, I'll go down, but I'm not going to clean my hands. Lincoln doesn't care. He puts that big hand out, grips William Stoddard, and by the time Lincoln leaves, Stoddard says, we had a great visit from this wonderful man. He knows more about our local politics than we do. Stoddard is an instant convert. Is one of the first to endorse Lincoln for the presidency, and eventually becomes one of his clerks in the White House. There is reward for being impressed by Abraham Lincoln. So this is what he does everywhere he goes. In Chicago, these gents who have bought the Chicago Press and Tribune are in their office. They hear this big, fat, loud footsteps on the entranceway outside their office, and they turn around and there's this rather unkempt fellow. They remember that he was wearing jeans, which I don't believe, but because when he practiced law, he didn't wear jeans. Presenting himself, Abraham Lincoln. I'm Abraham Lincoln. I'd like to subscribe to your paper. That thus begins the relationship between Lincoln and the Chicago Tribune. They think he's a rustic and sort of a clod, and then he talks, and they're totally enthralled. Does it everywhere he goes, and it's just an amazing example of how brilliant he was at courting people. And he spent more time than we've realized, I think, courting journalists.
Now, you mentioned already Greeley and Raymond and Bennett and their political aspirations and the many hats that they wore. I wondered if you could just perhaps give us a few examples of their relationships during the war proper with Lincoln himself.
Okay, and I always have to do three of them at once.
Yeah.
Bennett, the Democrat, is dubious about fighting to save the Union. He wants commerce to be kept up with the South. He doesn't want secession to be a barrier. And after Fort Sumter, when he fails to fly the American flag in the wake of an outpouring of red, white, and blue in New York City, which is where Major Anderson comes right after he surrenders the fort, well, he gets a rude awakening when a crowd of angry people surround the New York Herald office and begin screaming at him. Suddenly a newsboy runs out of the building, and then 5 minutes later he runs back with a flag under his arm. The flag is unfurled from the window. The mob is sort of disappointed because they wanted to sack the building. And all of a sudden James Gordon Bennett is pro-Union. And he remains pro-Union during the war, but critical, especially of emancipation, especially of black recruitment. At the beginning of the war, Horace Greeley says, let them go in peace. And then when the war starts, he says, let's have a vigorous war. And then when the Union loses the Battle of Bull Run, he says, I can't sleep, I'm suicidal. Mr. Lincoln, if you continue the war, it's on your head, whatever casualties occur. So he's off the reservation. Henry Raymond, at the beginning of the war, and I'm just going to end with the beginning, and then we can talk about 1864. In the beginning of the war, Henry Raymond, who had supported William Seward for the nomination, was pretty disappointed, although he was dutifully supportive of Lincoln for the Republican nomination. But Henry Raymond never stops pining for Seward, and after the lull after Fort Sumter, he writes a series of editorials, wanted a policy, wanted a leader. Lincoln is really annoyed. Doesn't say so publicly, files them under a file that he calls, vicious editorials, or now I can't remember the adjective, but he's not happy. Doesn't make it public. And now we all know that Seward, around this time, devises a scheme that he thinks is going to make him de facto prime minister of the United States. he writes a memorandum to Lincoln saying, somebody's got to take control here. Somebody's got to be a leader, get it, the same phrase, and I'm perfectly happy to do this and this and this and this. Now, Lincoln very famously scotched all this. And after that, Seward was loyal as anything to Lincoln. But when this was all transpiring, to show how connected editors were with politicians, Henry Raymond gets on a train from New York, goes to Washington, sets himself up in Seward's house, which he makes his newsroom, so he can be positioned to broadcast the news that his old buddy, his old hero, William Seward, has taken over the government. And of course, he doesn't have a story to send. Lincoln calls him in. And all through the war, he never sees James Gordon Bennett. Having James Gordon Bennett at the White House is like sort of inviting a prostitute to the White House. So all he wants is to go to tea. Never gets to go to tea. Horace Greeley is a tough one to manage, but Mr. Raymond of the Times, he seems to have been one of these guys who, when he met Abraham Lincoln and in any occasion, fell under that famous spell. Raymond was a little guy. His competitors called him the little villain. Speaking of, that's what Lincoln's adjective was, villainous editorials. And I wonder if it's because he knew that Raymond was called the little villain, which I didn't mention in the book. I keep thinking of all the things I didn't mention in the book, and that's one of them. I think that's why he said villainous editorials. So Raymond is a little guy. I think Lincoln probably put that big hand on his shoulder and practically squashed him into the ground in the style we've come to learn LBJ used with people, because he was bigger than almost everybody. Raymond wrote and said, Mr. Lincoln said to me, he's so busy dispensing patronage that he can't deal with the rest of the crisis in the country, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. Well, it's not reasonable, but once he fell under his thrall, he was enthralled. And every time he ever had a problem with Raymond, he called him down to Washington. And a little personal charm went a long way with Raymond.
Well, finally, Harold, I'll let you go on this question. You're a very busy man, and I appreciate you squeezing us
Sure.
in. Overall assessment of Lincoln and his handling of the press. How would you come down on this?
Inventor of direct contact with the people through the press, sort of the predecessor of the fireside chat and the Kennedy-esque news conference. A man who understood that the press was issuing the first draft of history, and he wanted to be the hero of the first draft of American history. And he's remained so because that first draft was so powerful. Persecutor of the press. Remember, and we didn't get to discuss it, the Lincoln administration shut down more than 200 Democratic newspapers during the Civil War. And mobs did their work as well against Democratic newspapers and, in some cases, Republican newspapers. But in the end, he said during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he who molds public opinion is more important than he who enacts statutes. Lincoln won public opinion. He knew he would live and be remembered by his great executive statute, the Emancipation Proclamation. But he's also remembered because he molded public opinion to accept that revolution in race relations and to sacrifice so much to save what he believed was sacred, and that's the American Union.
Fair enough, Harold. Well, thank you so much again for coming on and speaking with us. Again, everyone, Harold Holzer's new book, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, The War for Public Opinion, now out with Simon & Schuster. It's a great read. I'm almost through it. It is a very thick read, but I promise you, you're not going to be disappointed, and I think it provides yet another wrinkle in this character that is Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president. So, Harold, again, thank you so much, and perhaps we can have you on again with the next project, whatever that might be.
See you in April 2015 with all the assassination remembrances we'll be doing.
Fair enough. Take care.
Okay. Thank you. You too.